All right, folks, so today we're going to get into how to write an offer using the new updated Form 501 from MAR, Massachusetts Association of Realtors. If you guys should all know, last week we had a home inspection law that went into effect in Massachusetts. So now it makes it illegal for you to present an offer with the buyer waiving home inspection, or I should say the seller cannot accept an offer where the buyer is proactively writing on the offer that they're choosing to waive home inspection. Okay, so the new updated form has that language removed because the old form had a spot where you can actually either delete or waive. So that is not allowed anymore, right? Under Massachusetts law, Chapter 93A violation if you do so. So the new offer has been updated. So I'm going to go in step by step how to write an offer. So if you've never written up an offer before, you're going to learn how to write an offer. I'll go into some of my tips and tricks as far as what I do when I write up offers. And if you like this template, you want a copy of it, reach out to me. I'll send you the template. All right, so the first thing we have here is the buyer. Now, my buyer is going to be none other than Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. You guys know who The Rock is, right? The great one himself. Now, if you notice, I left the address blank, and I do this for a couple of reasons. Mainly because I don't know when that contract is going to expire. I know, the MLS, there's a date there. Sometimes agents don't put the right date. I'm just saying. So what I don't want is that's it. We're getting close to that expiration period. I don't want the seller, to get any ideas as far as, oh, I see where the address is. Maybe I'll write the buyer a letter directly and try to, go around the agents and create a mess. So I leave that part blank. On the seller side, and we have Kevin Hart here. Of course, you got to have Kevin Hart. I do have the address listed, and you should have the seller's address here, and all sellers' information should be here. If there's multiple sellers, put that in there. If it's a trust, put that in there, who the trustee is, all that good stuff. I would absolutely do it. If you leave it blank, it looks sloppy, right? I know it says on it, owner of record. Yeah, don't leave it blank. Put something in there. Next, we're going to have the name of the licensee, the person, the agent that's presenting the offer. You're going to put your name in there. I put my name. And next is going to be affiliated with which brokerage. That's going to be your brokerage, right? So whatever brokerage you're affiliated with, you want to put that information there. And it says right on it, right? Name of brokerage. So, it's kind of self-explanatory. I'm with eXp Realty, so I'm going to put eXp Realty there. And then we're going to go down to the next step. Now, the next step here is going to pretty much ask, in what capacity are you representing your client? I am a buyer's agent, so I'm checking off buyer's agent in this box here. Next is going to ask you on whose behalf. Right? On whose behalf are you being, you're representing them as a buyer's agent? Well, it's going to be the buyer. So I have Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson again. Again, if there's multiple buyers, put everybody that's on it. You're going to put it in that line, and it says so. Now, the next portion here, it's an advisory for the agents, understanding that just because on the offer you wrote that you're a buyer's agent, it doesn't alleviate you of the necessity to do the mandatory disclosure form. So remember, you still need that. This doesn't replace that. You still need that mandatory disclosure form in conjunction with this offer. So next we have the property address that your buyer is purchasing. Now, there's a lot of space here, and sometimes, back in the day, I should say that, we would add, the lot size and maybe something else that was there, or maybe if you're purchasing, two properties, you're doing a package deal, you would put that information all on that one line. Now, the next one, been introduced by, right? Now here, and I've seen a lot of different things, but really it's who introduced the property to the client, right? So in this case, it's going to be me. I'm the one that, through my efforts, I introduced the property to this buyer, and this buyer wants to move forward and present an offer. So I'm going to put the name of the brokerage, and then I always put dash, and then my name as a representative, as the agent for the brokerage. All right, so now we're going to get into the purchase price. So let's say for this example, the purchase price is $800,000. So we're going to put what your client wants to offer for the property there. The next piece we have is the earnest money deposit. Now, again, check with your client because some people have more flexibility than others, right? And you're going to, put whatever they're comfortable with. You might have seen, 500, maybe 1,000, 5,000. Obviously, the more you put in this field, the stronger the offer is going to be, right? Because that's upfront money. In this case here, we're going to do $5,000. And then you have two options. Is it going to be delivered to the sellers or the seller's agent with the offer? Or are you going to deliver it upon acceptance of the offer? I always choose upon acceptance of the offer for really the number one reason is that most people don't use checkbooks anymore, right? Everything's done electronically. So what we're saying is that, listen, if the offer gets accepted, then we will present either a certified check or, use deposit link or payload, and then we will send the money once the offer's been accepted. The next is going to be the purchase and sales amount, and this is going to vary. And what's interesting about this is depending on where you are in Massachusetts, there's different customs when it comes to that, right? I'm in Worcester County. We see people sometimes only doing 3%, maybe 5% of whatever the purchase price is going to be. That's what they put here. In other counties, we're seeing more. We're seeing the full 20 or 25% down or more. So, depending on where you are, the customs in your area, you want to have a conversation with your buyer. Ultimately, it's going to be what your buyer's comfortable doing and what they have liquid, what they have for assets to be able to do that. Because remember, this is going to be given at the time of purchase and sales. So if they have to take money from their 401k or whatever it is, there's a timing that you have to make sure that you're mindful of, because they may not have that money liquid, and then they might be out of contract if the dates aren't working out the right way. All right, now the next piece is going to be compensation to buyer broker. Now again, right, with the NAR settlement, if you should have a buyer broker agreement with your buyer, going over what your compensation is going to be. Now, if your buyer is asking the seller to contribute and to help them financially to cover some of your costs and closing costs or whatever it is, or all of your costs, whatever, this is where you're going to be able to do so. Now you have two options. You can either do, it's a percentage of the gross sale price, or it could be a flat fee. Whatever you have on your buyer broker agreement, whatever you've negotiated with your client, then here you can request that the seller offer some financial assistance. So here put in, commonly it's percentage. Put, whatever that figure is, and then you move on. Underneath that, you're going to see there's two check boxes, okay? One of them, the first one, it reads, this compensation is independent of and in addition to the blank offer of compensation made by the listing broker to the buyer broker, or you have, there is no offer of compensation made by the listing broker to the buyer broker, or that offer was rejected. Now, listen, there are still brokerages out there that still want to operate and do broker-to-broker compensation. So if that broker or brokerage is offering compensation in any capacity, and what you're going to receive here is going to be in addition to what that brokerage is going to offer you, well, then you got to put it there, right? You're disclosing it there. For EXP, we don't do broker-to-broker compensation anymore. That was part of our settlement agreement. Therefore, the second box is always checked off. Either that the other brokerage is not offering compensation, or we are rejecting it even if they are. So we do not want to be compensated by the other brokerage in any shape, way, or form. If we are going to receive any type of assistance, or my buyer is going to receive any type of assistance financially, we want that to be done from the seller directly, and that'll be at the HUD statement. So again, check with your brokerage, figure out what your policies are. But if you're an EXP agent, you absolutely want that second box checked off. Now the duration of the offer, and you can play with this, right? There's some strategy behind this. If you're presenting an offer, they're doing an open house on Sunday and it's Friday, you might say, look, you only have 24 hours to think about and accept the offer. If not, the offer is going to be void. So talk to your client and figure out, what's a good timeline to give them. Doing an offer and saying it's due in 12 hours or 5 hours, you're kind of pushing the seller a little bit, right? So, I would say at minimum 24 hours, I've gone as far as maybe 3 days, depending on the circumstances and what's going on. Number 4, the purchase and sales agreement. Now, right, there's a rule of thumb there. So if right now we're in mid-October, right? So as this is filming, we're mid-October. My client wishes to close at the end of November, right? So that gives us about 6 weeks. So we have a lot of time there. Typically, if we're going to do a 30-day closing, then I would schedule the P&S probably, 10 to 14 days from when the offer is accepted, right? So if it's today, I would go out maybe 10 days, 10, 12 days, depending on where that falls, and I would choose a date there. Also, the type of financing is going to play a role. If you have FHA financing, you kind of want to get that P&S done quick because the appraiser a lot of time doesn't want to go out to the property until you have the P&S already drafted and done. They want to look at the P&S. So, check with your lender, that financing could play a role because a lot of things pretty much are at a standstill until the P&S is actually executed, and then things move on. If you have a VA loan, if you have a USDA loan, you want to get that P&S done as quickly as possible because it can make some delays. Okay, so play it by ear. For me, I put this November 7th, which kind of gives us 2 weeks from now, just about, and that's an adequate time to do any inspections or and especially you have to think about as well, if you're doing septic inspections, well inspections, pest inspections, other things other than home inspection, right? So for me, the 7th, with today being the 20th, that kind of worked out. I chose that day because we're closing at the end of November. And we have traditional financing, meaning we're going conventional. We're not going FHA. If we were doing FHA, I probably would push this up to like maybe, November 1st or something like that. Now, the closing, again, have a conversation with your buyer and figure out what's a good date and time. Now, I purposely chose the 27th. If you look at the 27th, that's a Thursday. I don't like closing on Friday. And again, it's up to the buyer. It's their decision. But here's my recommendation. The reason why is because if there's a problem on Friday, you got to wait until Monday for it to get resolved, right? So if your buyers have a moving truck and all this other stuff and the seller doesn't want to grant use and occupancy, you're stuck. Like you can't move in for the weekend, right? So I like a Thursday closing. So that way, if there's a problem, we have Friday to fix it. So number 6, we have the escrow. Who's going to hold the escrow deposit? It should be the listing brokerage, not the listing agent. I've actually seen that written in offers. Listing agent. No. First of all, that's sloppy. Put a name, right? So if it's the name of a brokerage, write the name of the brokerage of who's going to hold the escrow. If it's a Remax, put a Remax. If it's whatever, put the actual brokerage name in there. If the brokerage is not going to hold escrow, then it's going to be an attorney, then write the attorney name in there, okay? So make sure you have something there, not list. First of all, listing agents can't hold money. It's illegal. They can't. It's the brokerage that holds money. So you want to make sure you have that or you have the attorney information. Now, read this and go over this with your clients, especially the seller, right? Because sometimes sellers believe that, all right, well, if we're holding, in this case, $5,000, well, if the rock walks away for whatever reason, that doesn't have a good reason to walk away, if he's not under the home inspection contingency or the financing contingency clause, then I get to keep that $5,000. It doesn't work that way. It states here that the escrow agent is going to hold the money. They're going to be neutral, right? But they will only release the money with the mutual instructions by both parties. So the seller and the buyer have to acknowledge, okay, if the buyer has to say, yeah, I signed, yep, the money can go to the seller. If the buyer doesn't sign that, it stays in limbo. It stays in that escrow account until either they go to court or they resolve, the issue, and they get something with mutual instructions. If we got to hold it and we go to court, then this states here that we will abide by whatever court decision is made. So if the judge says give the money to whomever, then that's what we will do. Okay, so when you as a seller sign this and you as a buyer sign this, you're agreeing to that policy. Okay, so make sure you're educating your clients on how that works. All right, so number 7, the inspection contingency. Now, this is where we see some changes here from the previous offer, right? Because the previous offer kind of gave you a little window, and then it said if you want to waive it, you can waive it. Well, that's not the case anymore. So here what we have is that the buyer has the right, says right on it, to perform a home inspection and any other inspection that they wish to at their cost. And you have to put a date here. Now, me typically, rule of thumb is, 5 to 10 days. Is typically a reasonable time to put a date in there. Now, and I say this reasonable time because that language was added to the home inspection law. So they didn't give you that, remember back in the day it was like an automatic like 10 days, right? You had 10 days to perform home inspection. Then I've given you 10 days. You're saying the buyer has the right to perform the inspection within a reasonable time. So what is reasonable? Well, 5 to 10 days is reasonable, right? What they don't want, and which could be illegal, is if you say that the inspection is going to be done in 24 hours, right? Because that could be code that you're trying to tell the seller that, hey, we're going to be really waiving home inspection. So when you look at this, we're just kind of faking that we're putting some stuff here, but we're going to, do the inspection in 24 hours. So you know what that means. Can't do that. Now, in some cases, that might be reasonable, right? If let's say the seller does not even the seller, but the buyer does a pre-inspection on the property before writing an offer. They actually have a home inspector go through the property, and then they say, okay, we're going to move forward and write an offer. Well, you know what? 24 hours might be reasonable in that case because they were able to perform a home inspection. So the whole idea is, and again, I'll do another video on the inspection law, is that the seller can't force the buyer to either limit, right, their home inspection or waive home inspection as a condition to get the offer accepted. So here you want to put in a reasonable time. And again, use what you've been doing so far. 5 to 7 days, 7 to 10 is fine. That's reasonable. 21 days, 30 days, that's not reasonable. Okay, so use that metric. I would say 5 to 10 days is reasonable. And again, depending on the market, because you might be in a market where maybe home inspectors, it's busy and you can't get a home inspector, right? So it might have to be a little bit longer. Or you might say, listen, I can get a home inspection done in, within 20, not 24, let's say 48 to 72 hours, right? So in that case, maybe 5 days would be reasonable. 4 to 5 days would be reasonable, depending on where the property's located and what home inspectors are scheduling out. So choose the right time. Now underneath here, you have a couple of options. So you have 2 boxes. The first box is, listen, the buyer says, look, I have the right to perform a home inspection. And if I am not satisfied in any capacity, then I have the right to walk away. No problem. That's the first box. That's what I chose here. The second box is the buyer can tell the seller, listen, I'm going to do a home inspection, but as long as repair costs don't exceed this amount, I'm moving forward. Now, here's another one. Under the law, you have to have a reasonable amount. So for instance, the purchase price here was $800,000. If I say, hey, I'm doing a home inspection, but as long as the repair costs don't exceed $800,000 or $200,000 or $400,000, well, that's unreasonable, right? That's code for seller, I'm waiving a home inspection, right? That's really what it is. So we want to have, if that's going to be your choice of the buyer, that listen, as long as repair costs don't exceed this, then that's great. And it has to be reasonable. And again, depending on the property, right? If your property is in great shape and you want to say, listen, seller, I'm not nickel and diming, right? If the outlet plate is broken or the gutter is bent, I'm not going to complain about that. So, maybe you put, $5,000 or $10,000 as long as it doesn't exceed that, I'm good with that. Okay. So that would be reasonable. But if you're coming up and you're saying, $100,000, $200,000, that's a problem. If the property is in rough shape, right? It needs the roof, it needs this, and you're looking at the property, you're like, look, I think it has good bones, but I want the inspector to go in there and make sure that, structurally everything is solid. And in my mind, I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to put this much money into rehab, but you have a budget. As long as you don't exceed that budget, then that may be reasonable. And I know that sounds crazy. You're like, well, listen, like I wish it was black and white. It's not. The law's not black and white, right? And honestly, the onus on this is to the listing agent. So listing agents, you need to really be looking at this field and seeing what the buyer is putting in here as far as dates and figures. Because if there's a claim, it's going to come to you. They're going to say, okay, well, listing agent, you saw that the home inspection was 24 hours. Did you question that? Did you ask for clarification? No? Okay, well then you're in trouble too, right? The dollar amount as far as repairs, is that reasonable for the property that you're selling, right? And again, we're not saying you need to quote prices and know what it is, but us being in the business, we have an idea of what certain things cost, right? We have an idea, not an exact quote, but we have an idea. So be reasonable with that and you'll be fine. Now, item 1 under this provision states here that the buyer, as long as they inform the seller in writing that they're going to back out, they'll be protected under the home inspection provision or contingency. Now, it does say here that they have up to 1 day from the date that's listed. So in this case, I had the 27th as far as a home inspection. So they have until the 28th by 5 o'clock the 28th to let us know if they are going to back out or not. If they don't back out, then at that point, it means that either they're moving forward or they're waiving their right to home inspection at that point. Now, number 2 is very interesting, okay? And I like this language a lot for number 2. Under number 2 is stating, listen, buyer, if you do not terminate in time, you are essentially waiving your right to a home inspection. Or buyer, If you choose to waive home inspection, I don't just, well, Louis, you just said you can't waive home inspection. Buyers can waive home inspection after the offer has been accepted. We just can't tell the seller up front that we're waiving the inspection to make it a deciding factor for the seller to accept the offer. Okay. So once the offer gets accepted, if the buyer turns around and says, you know what, I'm going to waive home inspection, they can do it. No problem. You're all set. However, read number 2. And it says, and this is what I like about it. It says if the buyer elects to waive home inspection, then they can't go after the listing broker. They can't go after the buyer broker, right? Because you had the right to perform an inspection. So if something shows up after the fact, again, nothing where, obviously we have disclosures that we have to disclose, right? We have affirmative disclosures that we have to be proactively disclose and all material defects. Aside from that, we disclose what we knew about the property, both parties. But you forego your home inspection. If there was something that had you done a home inspection, you would have found this problem, well, guess what? You can't come after the brokerages. You can't come after the seller. You can't come after us. So buyers, make sure that this is what you really want to do. And then number 3 just kind of reiterates the law, saying that the buyers cannot waive home inspection at this time. They cannot proactively waive home inspection under the new home inspection law. They can choose to do it after the fact. And then additional provisions here, if there's any other additional provision that you're adding to that. All right, so number 8, we're going to have the mortgage contingency. Now, this is important too, and the dates in this really, really matter. Now, the first thing is, and again, this is stating that if the buyer cannot achieve financing by a certain date. Now, there's more to that, right? As long as the buyer is not negligent, right? Meaning, and we know this, we tell buyers, listen, don't open up credit cards, don't take out loans, don't go to Jordan and buy a whole bunch of furniture and say, well, listen, if the Red Sox win, it's going to be free. Doesn't matter. It's going to show up on your credit report. Okay. So don't do that. So as long as the buyer's not negligent, they're still kind of protected under this mortgage contingency clause. So really it states that if the lender cannot give you financing by this date, you can back out, you get your deposit back, everything is good. But you got to be mindful of the dates. Now, the first thing you're going to see here is, well, what's the financing amount? Now, there's different schools of thought here. You can actually do the calculations of whatever it is and put in that actual number, and that's fine, right? You can do that. In some cases, that might work. Some cases, it doesn't. And what I mean by that is that number, if it's a specific number, now we have to make sure that the property appraised. And as long as you are financing that number or lower, you're going to move forward. Okay. And this is where you want to have a conversation too with the lender, where in the event of, well, what if the property doesn't appraise? Lender, if you verify that they have the assets to cover the appraisal, are you going to make them make up the difference? Right? Most lenders are going to say no, but there are some lenders out there that will, right? So this is why, again, it's important that you deal with a local lender, a reputable lender that will work with you and say, yeah, in the case, the property doesn't appraise and we don't hit that number, then yeah, we're going to deny the loan. We're not going to move forward. Okay. So what I do, instead of calculating the number, what it actually is, I do this. I kind of cheat a little bit. And if I'm saying, listen, my buyer's doing 90% LTV, that means they're going to borrow 90%, they're putting 10% down. Okay. So I write in 90% LTV. Why? Because it doesn't matter what the purchase price is. If it goes up by 10,000, 20,000, whatever it is, my buyer's still doing 90% loan to value. Right. So it just makes it easier for me. You can do whatever you want. You can run the numbers or you can do this. That's fine. And then I put a dash and I put the type of financing. It's conventional, FHA, VA, whatever it is. I put a dash and I do that there. Okay. So you do what works for you. Terms and condition by. This is going to be the commitment date. The date that the bank is going to issue a commitment letter stating that, yes, they are committed, that you are approved for this loan, and that you're going to close. Okay. Now for this date, I normally do, like, again, depending on, how many days we have in the offer. So in this case, we have a lot of time. We're mid-month. We're closing at the end of November. I chose November 17th, which is like the Monday before we're scheduled to close. We're going to close on a Thursday. The week before that Monday, we should have the commitment letter from the bank. That's plenty of time. Okay. If we're doing a 30-day close, then, that commitment letter, I'm like right at the end of week 3, maybe that Thursday, maybe that Friday, because the bank, and again, talk to your lender, depending on the type of loan that you have, they might need more time. If you're doing a VA loan, you're not doing it in 30 days. It's not happening, right? FHA might not happen in 30 days, right? As we see that we have less and less FHA appraisers out there and things, and especially with the government shutdown and all that, you might have to go 45 days, right? So talk to your lender. They're going to guide you as far as what you should be putting for a date there. But that's why I chose the 17th. We have plenty of time. A week before that Monday, we could be good. We can probably even do it a little bit sooner. I'm going to do that because it's going to give the greatest protection for my buyer. The listing agent, or the seller might push back a little bit, ask for an explanation of what's going on. I'll talk to my client and we'll negotiate that if that's something that we need to negotiate on. But right off the bat, I'm going to ask that and see if we can move forward with that date. Now, the next date here is very important. This is the application date, right? So remember, a pre-approval is not an application, right? So once the offer gets accepted, you're going to get immediately, so as soon as it gets accepted, you need to give this to your loan officer because they need to start the actual application. Now, I normally do 3 days from acceptance, right? So, we said that, the offer expires tomorrow. We're going to give them 24 hours. So I'm putting, I put this out for Friday and say, look, as long as we submit an application by Friday, your buyer is going to be protected under the mortgage contingency. Okay. That's important because if they submit the application on Saturday or Monday of the following week, that's void. It's done. They're not protected because they didn't do everything in time. So make sure that, again, talk to your loan officer, make sure they're not on vacation or whatever it is, that you're going to be able to get that application in place by that date. And that's why as soon as the offer gets accepted, that is the first thing I send out is to the loan officer, the accepted offer, so they can submit the application immediately. And then coach your buyers. Listen, they're going to ask you for updated paperwork. They're going to ask you again for, updated pay stubs and bank statements and all this other stuff. And that's okay. Right? It's not that the loan officer forgot about the stuff that you submitted. You might have submitted documents, months ago, and now we're submitting an offer. They're going to ask you again. That's okay. It's part of the process. Just do it as quickly as possible. So that way we can get to P&S and we can get the appraiser out there so we can move forward quickly. Now, number 9, representations and acknowledgement. So the first part here is going to say, it's an acknowledgement that the buyer has the right to perform a lead paint inspection. Now, they can waive that inspection. Now, you might be saying, well, Louis, I thought you said you can't waive anything up front. You can't waive home inspection. So in that home inspection contingency clause, it's home inspection. Now, the law actually has a language for what constitutes a home inspection. And it's going to be, the roof, the interior, the exterior of the property, right? Anything that pertains to the home. Septic system is separate. Pest inspection is separate. Right? Well inspections are separate. That isn't a typical home inspection. So the buyer has the right to perform a home inspection to inspect the structure of the property, the integrity of items in the property and that type of stuff. Okay. Lead paint is an extra inspection. So lead paint falls on that your buyer can still upfront. That's affirmative disclosure. You gotta submit the lead paint notification with the offer. So if your buyer is intending to waive that, no problem. You can click waive and you're all set. You're within the law. You're okay. Or if they're going to do a home inspection, then click, yeah, I'm doing a home inspection. And they have up to 10 days to do that home inspection at their cost. So that's one. The second acknowledgement is the mandatory disclosure form. That consumer understands in what capacity do you represent them. So if you're a buyer's agent, you're working in their best interest as a buyer's agent, right? What if you are a seller's agent and they're an unrepresented buyer, right? Well, you're disclosing that too up front. So then, the offer will look a little bit different, especially at the top. But, but this is here telling the consumer that there's an acknowledgement. They understand how you represent them in what capacity and the lead paint laws if the property was built before 1978. Now we're going to get into the other stuff on the bottom. And this is going to be more of an acknowledgement that you are only a real estate professional. That's it. You're not an inspector. You're not an attorney. You're not, a lender. You're not any of these other things. You're not an architect. You're not a septic design person. That is not you. So the consumer should not rely on you for any of that other additional information. They should consult with professionals. Taxes, that's another one, right? They should consult with professionals if they have questions regarding those areas, right? They want to speak to those experts, not you. You're not an expert in that. You're an expert at, market, market conditions, writing up the offer, negotiating. Those are your skills, right? Helping to protect the buyer or the seller, depending on what you're doing. That's your playground. That's your forte. That's what you do, right? That's part of your value. But all the other stuff, no. So on the bottom here, it's going to say you're going to write none, saying that you're not making any other claims or any other types of representation, that you're more than just an agent. Then the question is, well, what if I'm a contractor, or what is the, can I add that in there? Talk to your broker. So I can tell you about that. Talk to your broker. They don't want you acting in any other, typically, I know I don't. They don't want you acting in any other capacity other than a real estate professional. And that's that. So typically, you should always say none, but talk to your broker if you have questions about that. Now, number 10. Now, this one's interesting too, right? Because it says in the event of a buyer's default, all monies tendered is going to be used for liquidated damages to the seller. Okay. Now we get into, well, at what point, right? Because if it's in the beginning, before we even get to P&S, well, it's only $5,000. Can the seller go after the deposit money for the P&S? How this reads, to me, it reads only they can only go after that $5,000. So explain that, to your buyers, explain that to your sellers. If we're past P&S, then there's language in the P&S that could say that, if the buyer defaults, the seller can go after everything. So just, have that conversation. Again, the money cannot be transferred according to the escrow rules that we have up there, that unless all parties agree to where that money is going. And again, if parties don't agree, as brokerages, we hold that money in our escrow account until either we go to court or until enough time moves on and we release it to the state, and then the state's going to make a decision on what's going on. They will reach out to the parties, and then they will say, look, here's what's going on, and here's the ruling, and this is what's this is what's happening. Number 11, additional terms. Now, this is one phrase I always add to all my offers, and it's the offer is subject to a mutually satisfactory purchase and sales agreement. Now, if you're in parts of Mass, where we start with an offer to purchase and then we go to purchase and sales, I love this language. Right? Because, especially in Worcester County, our attorneys here, they modify the P&S. They add riders, they add addendums to it, and so forth. Okay? Technically, if you don't have language like that, mutually satisfactory purchase and sales, the seller or the seller's attorney can draft the P&S and say, here you go. Right? Sign it. The offer just said there's going to be a P&S. I'm going to draft the P&S. Didn't say that it had to be mutually satisfactory. So here you go. It's a standard P&S, sign it and go from there. Most attorneys, especially in Worcester County, are going to say, yeah, no, don't sign it the way it is, right? We want to add some extra layers of protection. And we want to add, some, hey, what if something happens? What if the house burns down? What if, right? We want to add some what ifs in there to protect you. So I always add that language in there. So that way, if an issue, comes to the P&S, my buyer has an out if they can't come to terms on the language of the P&S. Here, you're going to add any other conditions. Is there going to be money for credit for closing costs, credited back? You're going to add that here, $5,000, to credit closing costs, whatever. If there's an appraisal contingency, you're going to add that here. If there's an escalation clause, you're going to add that here. Okay. Now, the cool thing about this and this field right here is that this MAR form, there's only a few lines. Now it's been modified. So if you exceed the character limit, it actually creates an addendum for you. So that's really, really cool. So you can just write forever and it'll itemize everything. Other stuff that I'll add is, property to be clean swept, secured, and vacant at time of closing. Right? So we're setting expectations. We want it to be broom swept, meaning that, don't leave your trash around. We want the property to be secured. So, the windows, they lock, the doors lock, everything, you don't have homeless people or people trying to squat, in the property. That's not happening. And everything is vacant. All their personal belongings are gone. So, I'll add some language like that. If there's any other things, maybe window treatments, that's a big one, right? If your client wants the window treatments, you might want to add some language in there, or stuff that they don't want, to happen, or if there's going to be a holdback, whatever it is, you're going to add it here as additional provisions. Also, if you are an agent and you're buying for yourself, right, you need to disclose in writing that you hold a Massachusetts license, I would put it in here. I would say the buyer is a real estate licensee in the state of Massachusetts or whatever state you're in. I would disclose that here in writing. Even though you might have done another disclosure, I would do it right there so there's no questions. So whatever they are, add your conditions here, and then make sure that everyone signs off on it. Make sure they sign the addendum that gets created. Remember, if you don't put it in writing, it means nothing. Whatever you guys discuss, if you had a conversation, the seller goes, oh yeah, I'm going to do this. And you know what? Before you leave, I'm going to make sure that the lawn is cut and all this other stuff. If it's not in writing, it means nothing. The seller is not obligated to perform anything unless it's in writing. So it's always to be safer than sorry, right? To do that. Also in here, if you're buying a condo, I'll add language where, I'll say, buyer has the right to review and approve, or subject to the buyer reviewing and approving condo docs by this date or whatever it is, or approving the financials, right? I'll add that language in there too, because, what if we were given wrong information when it came to a condo, and we thought that we can have pets, and now there's no pet policy, and I have a dog, right? I'm not going to move forward with this deal. If I don't have that language in there, then guess what? I have to now go spend money on a home inspection in order to, to back out and say that the home inspection is why I'm backing out. So having that language in there is going to protect your buyers. And then lastly, your buyers are going to sign off on it. And that's it. So they're going to sign. You're going to present the offer to the listing agent. They're going to present it to the seller. And that's it. If they accept, well, they're going to sign underneath. You're going to see that they'll check off. They should be checking. Again, some agents, they don't, it is what it is. But, as long as you see that the accept is checked off and you have the buyer's signature, the seller's signature on it, you're good. You now have an accepted offer, and then you can move forward. All right, folks. So listen, I hope you found it helpful. I know there were some different changes, from the original offer. If you would like a copy of the template, let me know. Again, the template's for educational purposes only. Check with your broker if you're not an EXP agent, as far as what their policies are. This is what I coach my agents, and they know this. They can, they can use this, and this is what I tell them. So I hope you found this helpful. I'll have some other videos about the home inspection law. We're also going to get into some clauses. Escalation clauses is one of the big ones that I get a lot of questions on, and the appraisal clauses. So if there's something specific you'd like to see, please reach out. I'll be happy to put it on video and show you how to do it. And excuse my allergies. It is what it is. So it's just happening. But thank you guys. And until next time.